Today's review is sponsored by my new short film, Message from the Watcher. It's sort of a modern-day take on When a Stranger Calls. Please go check that out and let me know what you think. Yeah, I know I'm prostituting myself, but it's my channel. I can do that if I want to.
Watch it, Alan. I'm shooting.
Blood Feast. Herschell Gordon-Lewis. His movies are cheesy, bloody, schlocky. They would definitely fit in the so bad it's good category. But he also might be one of the most important directors for modern horror and grindhouse cinema, at least up there with the likes of Alfred Hitchcock and George Romero. For the next three reviews, we're going to take a look at Herschell Gordon-Lewis's Blood Trilogy: Blood Feast, 2000 Maniacs, and Color Me Blood Red. It's time to show some respect to the godfather of gore. Herschell Gordon-Lewis started releasing movies in the 1960s, which was the decade when horror was transitioning from the era of classic gothic horror and 50s B-movies into the modern era of horror, and Blood Feast was one of the most important stepping stones that led to modern horror. I know that sounds weird. When we think of influential movies that led to the horror genre that we have today, we usually think of Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, Peeping Tom by Michael Powell, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. I would also put Blood and Black Lace by Mario Bava in that category. But to say that Psycho...
We all go a little mad sometimes.
...is in the same category as Blood Feast.
You see, in the ancient days, it required a young maiden like yourself to be offered to bless the feast.
A lot of people are gonna ask what the fuck is wrong with me. We'll get into that after the plot. Why Blood Feast is important, not what the fuck is wrong with me. It's a lot of things. In Blood Feast, we follow psychotic Egyptian caterer Fuad Ramses. His ultimate goal here is to resurrect the goddess Ishtar.
Oh my goddess, I am your slave, my lady of the dark moon.
And just how do you resurrect a goddess Ishtar? You need a cannibalistic feast, obviously. Cannibalism is very important to Ishtar resurrections. So Ramses tricks this woman, who's throwing a dinner party for her daughter's birthday, into having an authentic Egyptian dinner, which just sounds delightful.
Have you ever had an Egyptian feast?
Why, that would be fine. That would be perfect. My daughter, Suzette, is a student of Egyptian culture.
So we watch as crazy-eyed Fuad Ramses kills beautiful women so he can collect their body parts for a cannibal feast that he intends to serve to a group of unsuspecting party guests. The movie sounds silly, but that's only because it is. The dialogue is cheesy.
Hey! You wouldn't sacrifice me on this altar, would you?
Of course not, my dear.
The acting is cheesy.
Everything happened so fast! All I saw was this shadow, and then I got it. I can't remember!
The gore scenes are cheesy. Everything about this flick puts it in the so bad it's good category, and it's one of the most important horror movies of the 1960s. This was the first movie to show explicit gore. Back in the 1930s, there was no rating system, so movies got away with showing a little more violence. But then in 1934, the Hays Code came out, which was a set of guidelines that said what was allowed to be shown in film. You could not have a lot of blood, and you could not have nudity. As things went along, there was a rule that you could have nudity in your film, but only if it was for educational purposes. It became big in the 1940s and 50s for certain directors to put nudity in their film and disguise them as educational movies, or documentaries. We'll get more into this in another video. The rating system that we know today did not come out until 1968, the same year as Night of the Living Dead. But in the early 60s, we had Herschell Gordon Lewis. Herschell started out in advertisement, but then he became an exploitation film director. His background in advertisement made him perfect for exploitation cinema. He knew exactly what to put in his movies to get people in the seats. He started out in nudie pictures and sexploitation films, but then he got the brilliant idea of adding blood and gore to his films. And so, in 1963, Blood Feast was born. At the time, the most graphic scenes in movies were the shower scene from Psycho, the execution of Ozza the Witch in Black Sunday, the operation scene in Eyes Without a Face. Normally, in movies from that time, whenever there was some kind of bloodshed, the camera would cut away, or it just wouldn't be that graphic. But Herschell Gordon Lewis came up with the idea of keeping the camera on the gore, and it became a huge success. It's true that Blood Feast has terrible acting and this all-around goofy feeling, but audiences had never seen this level of violence on film before, and that's what resulted in people packing out drive-ins and movie theaters. Blood sells, people, never forget that. There is a cheapness to Blood Feast. Herschell only had a budget of $24,500, and he made the movie in 5 days. As a result, it drips with this no-budget charm. You have this guy who had no money, making a movie with limited resources, and it becomes a huge stepping stone for gore films and splatter flicks. Looking at the gore effects, they clearly are cheap, and they don't look anywhere near as good as gore effects in later movies. But that's because these kinds of gore effects didn't really exist back then. So Herschell Gordon Lewis had to, essentially, create gore effects. He created his own concoction for the blood. He wasn't satisfied with the stage blood that they had back then, so he made his own. Everything we see in Blood Feast, and what we see in his later movies, eventually led to the gore that we see in Night of the Living Dead, the gore in Bay of Blood, and of course Tom Savini gore effects. In many ways, Blood Feast is another grandfather to the slasher genre. It goes Psycho, Blood Feast, and Blood and Black Lace. You can throw Peeping Tom in there too. A lot of people love the kills in the Friday the 13th franchise. Well, they would not exist without Herschell Gordon Lewis. Blood Feast is definitely one of those movies that you laugh at, and Herschell Gordon Lewis was well aware of that. There are so many laughably bad moments that you can't help but love. From the silly dialogue to the over-the-top performances, Fuad Ramses, played by Mal Arnold, gives such a fun, bad performance. He's constantly chewing the scenery, and he has one of my favorite things in cheap grindhouse movies, a good set of crazy eyes.
It has not been served for 5,000 years.
But everybody gives a fun, bad performance. There are quite a few scenes where you can tell that people are reading their lines.
certain limbs and organs have been removed. This Pat Tracy that we found yesterday, the lab says her heart was cut out.
As much as I praise the gore, I also have to praise the pacing. The movie is only 67 minutes long, and I've got to give credit for that. As someone who watches a lot of low to no budget movies, there's one huge problem that I notice in a lot of the bad ones, and that is padding out your movie with nothing. I've said it before, my two main issues with bad B movies is when the filmmakers don't take advantage of their idea, and when they fill their movie with padding. If you saw my review of Don't Go in the Woods, that was my main complaint. The filmmakers obviously didn't have enough ideas for a full-length feature film, so they filled the movie with padding. You see this all the time in bad B movies. There are so many scenes of people just walking around, sitting around, standing around, driving around, dicking around, doing mundane tasks with excruciating detail, and you can tell that this was only done to pad out the movie's runtime. But that's not the case with Herschell Gordon Lewis. He made his movies as long as they needed to be. Blood Feast, 67 minutes. With so many movies nowadays with runtimes of 2.5 to 3 hours, it's refreshing to see a movie that's short, sweet, and to the point. 67 minutes, that's all it needs to be. Blood Feast has a loyal following, but it also has people that just aren't going to like this movie. That's fine. I'm proud to be a fan of this movie, but I can also understand why people would not like Blood Feast. No-budget movies like this can be an acquired taste. I still encourage any horror fan to watch this movie and make their own decision, because it's an important part of horror history. But I will say, it's okay if you do not like Blood Feast, but you have to respect it. And with that, let's get to the grindhouse rankings. We've got a body count of 8. The kills consist of, but are not limited to, limbs getting hacked off, tongues getting ripped out, guts getting ripped out, everything a growing boy needs. The movie is definitely a so bad it's good movie. It has that charm we expect in fun bad B movies. Both the acting and dialogue are over the top. It adds to the entertainment. Fouad Ramses is a fun villain. He's not intimidating at all, but we like seeing him chew the scenery. The gore effects are cheap but great. Blood Feast is an important part of horror film history. Not only do we see the birth of gore films, but the birth of gore effects as well. I'm giving this flick a 4.3 out of 5. I don't usually give such high ratings to so bad they're good movies, but because Blood Feast is so important in the history of horror, I had to give it a higher rating. Gore fans will love it, and horror buffs should watch it. As always, I want to thank everyone for watching and supporting my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if you like what I do here, or give it a thumbs down if you don't like what I do here. Leave a comment down below. What are some of your favorite cheap gore movies? This is the Maniac, here to remind you that the grindhouse will never die. You can't spell Gordon without Gore, and you can't spell Lewis without ew. And you can't spell Herschell without hell. Knew I could get that to work.